The voice in your head isn't reporting on your life, it's quietly authoring it. And the strangest part is that you've probably never once stopped to ask who taught it to speak the way it does. Carl Jung believed something about that inner voice that most people go their whole lives without understanding. He didn't think of it as a neutral commentator, a little narrator sitting behind your eyes describing events as they happen. He came to see it as something far more active than that, something with its own momentum, its own history, its own agenda, a presence inside you that has been shaping what you notice, what you fear, and what you believe is possible, long before you ever consciously chose any of it. Jung spent years studying the way the psyche talks to itself, and what he found unsettled him. The people who suffered most weren't always the ones with the hardest lives. They were often the ones whose inner voice had turned against them so completely that no external success could reach them. And the ones who transformed, the ones whose entire reality seemed to reorganize, almost always started in the same place. They changed the conversation happening inside their own skull. Today, I want to walk you through what Jung actually discovered about that inner voice, where it comes from, why it sounds the way it does, why simply trying to think positive almost never works, and the specific shift in how you speak to yourself that Jung believed could genuinely alter the reality you live inside. Because if the voice in your head has been narrating your limitations back to you for years, there's a good chance you've mistaken its opinion for the truth. And that mistake shapes everything. Let's start with something Jung understood that took psychology decades to catch up to. That voice inside you, the one commenting on your choices, predicting your failures, judging your reflection in the mirror, it isn't really you. Not in the way you assume. It feels like you because it uses the word I. It says, "I'm not good enough. I always mess this up. I knew this would happen." The grammar tricks you into thinking these are your own conclusions, arrived at freely. But Jung recognized something stranger going on underneath. He called these inner voices complexes. A complex, in his framework, is a cluster of feelings, memories, and beliefs that organizes itself around a wound and starts behaving almost like a separate personality inside you. It has its own emotional charge. It gets triggered by specific situations. And once activated, it takes over the microphone completely, speaking through you as if it were the whole of who you are. Think about what happens when someone criticizes your work. For most people, there's a moment where the entire inner atmosphere shifts. A voice rises up, cold, certain, cutting. And it doesn't just say, "That was a fair point." It says, "You're a fraud. You've always been a fraud, and now they can see it too." That voice isn't measured. It isn't reasonable. It's disproportionate, and it arrives with the force of absolute authority. Jung would say that's a complex speaking. It's autonomous. You didn't summon it. It seized the moment. What disturbed Jung most was how convincingly these voices impersonate our own judgment. We don't experience them as intrusions. We experience them as insight. When the harsh inner narrator declares that we'll never change, we don't hear a wounded fragment repeating an old script. We hear the sober truth about ourselves, finally spoken plainly. And so we believe it. We organize our lives around it. Here's the part that changes everything. Where did that voice learn its lines? Jung was clear that these inner speakers don't generate spontaneously. They're assembled piece by piece from the voices that surrounded us before we had any capacity to filter them. The parent who sighed with disappointment, the teacher who singled you out, the relentless comparison, the conditional approval, the offhand comment that landed like a verdict. You absorbed those tones the way a room absorbs smoke, and over years, the external voices became internal. The critic who lived across the dinner table moved into your head, took up residence, and never left. Now it speaks in the first person. Now it sounds like you. But the accent, if you listen closely, belongs to someone else entirely. This is why Jung was so skeptical of the cheerful advice that fills so many self-improvement books. Just think positive. Just replace the negative thought with a good one. Just tell yourself you're wonderful in the mirror every morning. He understood why people reach for this, but he also saw why it usually fails, and fails in a way that leaves people feeling more broken than before. When you paste a positive affirmation over a wounded complex, you're not healing anything. You're staging a shouting match between two voices, and the wounded one has decades of practice. You say, "I am confident and capable," and something underneath answers, instantly, "No, you're not," and you know it. The affirmation floats on the surface, the complex owns the depths, and the deeper voice almost always wins, because it isn't arguing, it's simply certain. Jung saw that you can't defeat these inner voices by contradiction. Contradiction only feeds them. The moment you declare war on a part of yourself, you split your psyche into a battlefield, and no one thrives on a battlefield. This is where his approach breaks from nearly everything you've been told about self-talk. He didn't believe the goal was to argue with the voice, silence the voice, or bully it into submission with relentless positivity. He believed the goal was to change your relationship to the voice entirely, and that begins with a move so simple it sounds almost too small to matter. You stop treating the voice as you, and you start treating it as something you can speak to. Imagine the difference. When the harsh narrator says, "You're going to fail at this," the old way is to either believe it and collapse or fight it and exhaust yourself. Jung's way opens a third door. You turn toward the voice and you say, "I hear you. You're afraid. What are you afraid of?" You address it as a presence with a history rather than a fact about reality. And in that single turn of attention, something shifts. You've stepped out of the voice and become the one listening to it. You've reclaimed the microphone. Jung developed an entire practice around this, which he called active imagination. It sounds mystical, but it's grounded and practical. The idea was to give the autonomous parts of the psyche a chance to speak, consciously, deliberately, on your terms, so that they stopped hijacking you from the shadows. Instead of the complex ambushing you at 3 in the morning, you'd sit down and invite the dialogue. You'd ask the fearful voice what it wanted. You'd ask the critic who it was really protecting you from. And in answering, these fragments would begin to soften, integrate, and lose their grip. Because here's what Jung understood about the inner critic that almost no one talks about. It isn't your enemy. It started as a bodyguard. That merciless voice that tears you down before anyone else can. Somewhere back in your history, it was trying to keep you safe. If it criticized you first, maybe the criticism from outside would hurt less. If it kept your expectations low, maybe you'd never risk the humiliation of trying and failing publicly. The voice is cruel, yes, but underneath the cruelty is a frightened, outdated strategy for survival that never got updated. When you understand this, the way you speak to yourself can finally change from the inside, not as a performance layered over the wound, but as a genuine response to it. You stop saying, "Shut up, I am confident." You start saying, "I know you're trying to protect me. You don't have to do it this way anymore." And that sentence, spoken inwardly and meant sincerely, does something the affirmation never could. It disarms the voice instead of provoking it. Before we go further into how this reshapes your actual reality, and it does, in ways Jung documented carefully, I want to mention something for anyone who's recognizing their own inner narrator in all of this. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises built directly from Jung's approach to the inner voice and the parts of ourselves we've never learned to speak to. It's made for exactly this kind of work, turning toward those voices instead of drowning them out. If the conversation happening inside you has been running unexamined for years, the link is right below. But let's keep going, because the next piece is where this stops being an idea and starts becoming a lived shift. So how does changing an inner voice change your outer reality? This is where Jung's thinking gets genuinely radical, and it has nothing to do with the universe magically rearranging itself around your good vibes. It's far more grounded than that, and far more unsettling. Jung insisted on something he repeated in various forms throughout his life. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Sit with that. The forces you don't examine inside yourself don't stay quietly inside. They leak outward. They shape your choices, your reactions, the situations you keep finding yourself trapped in. And because you can't see the source, you experience the results as simply the way life is, as your luck, as your nature, as fate. The inner voice is one of the main channels through which this happens. Consider someone whose internal narrator has spent 30 years repeating that they're unlovable. That voice doesn't just sit there generating sadness. It governs behavior. It makes them flinch away from intimacy before it can arrive. It makes them read neutral expressions as rejection. It makes them test the people who care about them until those people finally leave, confirming in a grim loop exactly what the voice predicted all along. From the outside, it looks like this person just keeps getting unlucky in relationships. The pattern seems to happen to them. But Jung would point directly at the narrator. The voice wrote the prophecy, then quietly arranged the conditions to fulfill it. Reality bent itself around the sentence running in the background, not through magic, through the thousand small decisions that voice was silently making on their behalf. This is what he meant by the psyche being real. He didn't mean it in some vague, inspirational sense. He meant that your inner life has genuine causal power in the outer world. The way you speak to yourself determines what you dare to attempt, what you interpret as possible, who you allow close, and how you respond in the exact moments that decide the course of your life. Change the internal narration, and you change the behavior it generates. Change the behavior, and the reality it produces changes with it. Here's a scene worth sitting inside. Two people receive the same opportunity, a chance to speak up in a meeting, propose an idea that could shift their entire career. In the first person, the inner voice says quietly and instantly, "Who do you think you are? They'll see right through you. Stay small." And so they stay silent. The opportunity passes. Nothing visibly bad happens, but a door quietly closed, and they'll never know it was there. In the second person, facing the identical moment, the inner voice says something different. Maybe just, "You've prepared for this. Say it even if your voice shakes." And they speak. Sometimes it lands, sometimes it doesn't, but the door stays open. Over years, thousands of these micro moments accumulate, and the two people end up living in what look like completely different worlds, occupying different realities, shaped at the root by the difference between two inner sentences spoken in a single, unremarkable second. That's the mechanism. It's not that positive thinking summons good fortune. It's that the voice you speak with in the privacy of your own mind is constantly making decisions on your behalf, and those decisions compound into a life. Jung watched this play out in his patients over and over. The transformation never started with the outer circumstances. It started when someone finally caught the voice in the act, heard it clearly, recognized it as a visitor rather than a fact, and began, deliberately, to speak differently. Now, what does speaking differently actually sound like? Because Jung was too honest a thinker to leave you with a vague instruction to just be kinder to yourself. There's a specific quality to the shift he pointed toward, and it's worth getting precise about. The first change is in how you relate to the voice's authority. Right now, if you're like most people, when the inner narrator delivers a verdict, you receive it as information about reality. "I'm going to embarrass myself" registers not as a fear, but as a forecast. The shift begins the moment you insert a small gap between the voice and your acceptance of it. You learn to hear the sentence and ask, without hostility, "Is that true? Or is that just the voice that's always afraid?" You're not fighting it. You're questioning its credentials. The second change is in the pronoun, oddly enough. Jung noticed the power of moving from "I am a failure" to something more distanced and honest. "There's a part of me that feels like a failure right now." The first sentence fuses you completely with the judgment. The second one holds it at arm's length where you can actually look at it. That tiny grammatical adjustment does real psychological work. It restores you as the observer rather than the verdict. You become the one who has the feeling instead of the one who is the feeling. The third change is the hardest and the most important. It's learning to speak to the wounded parts of yourself the way you'd speak to a frightened child you genuinely loved, rather than the way a disappointed authority once spoke to you. When you fail at something, the old voice snarls. The new voice, the one Jung would have you cultivate, says, "That was hard, and you tried, and you're allowed to be shaken by it." This isn't coddling. It's the difference between a psyche that heals and one that keeps reopening the same wound because the internal environment is too hostile for anything to mend. I want to be careful here because this can sound softer than Jung ever was. He was not describing a life of gentle self-soothing. The individuated person, his term for someone who's done this integration work, isn't endlessly nice to themselves. They're honest with themselves, which is a much rarer and harder thing. Sometimes the honest voice says, "You avoided this because you were scared, and the avoidance is costing you." That's not cruelty. That's the inner voice finally telling the truth instead of either flattering you or flogging you. Because both extremes are distortions. The savage inner critic lies by exaggerating your worthlessness. But the falsely cheerful voice lies too, by papering over what actually needs to be faced. Jung wanted neither. He wanted a voice inside you that could be trusted, one that neither inflates you nor destroys you, but sees you clearly and speaks to you accordingly. That kind of inner voice is rare, precisely because most of us never chose our narrator. We inherited it. And an inherited narrator will always speak in someone else's interest, using someone else's fears. There's a moment in this work that Jung's patients described again and again, and it's worth naming because you might recognize it when it comes. It's the moment you catch the voice mid-sentence and realize, with a strange jolt, that it isn't yours. You hear it say something cutting, and for the first time you notice the tone belongs to your father, or the exact phrasing your mother used, or the sneer of someone who hurt you long ago. And in that instant of recognition, the spell breaks. You can't fully believe a voice once you've seen whose mask it's wearing. That recognition is the beginning of freedom. Because a voice you've identified as a visitor no longer commands the same obedience. You can listen to it, understand where it came from, even feel compassion for the frightened history that created it, and still decline to let it write your next chapter. This is what Jung meant by making the unconscious conscious. You drag the hidden narrator into the light, and in the light, it loses the power it only ever had in the dark. Let me be honest about the difficulty, because Jung always was. This work is slow, and the voice fights back. A complex that has run your inner life for decades doesn't surrender its position after one insightful afternoon. You'll catch it, name it, speak to it differently, and then 3 days later it'll ambush you again as if nothing happened, and for a moment you'll believe every word. That's normal. That's the process. The point isn't to win once. The point is to keep turning toward the voice, again and again, until the turning becomes your default instead of the collapsing. And something shifts as you practice. The voice doesn't vanish, but its volume drops. It stops being the whole sky and becomes one weather pattern among many. You start to notice the space around it, the part of you that's doing the noticing, the calm observer that was always there underneath the noise. Jung believed that observer was closer to your true center than any of the clamoring voices. He called that deeper center the self, and he believed that the entire journey of a human life was really about relocating your sense of identity from the frightened, borrowed voices to that quiet center that was never wounded in the first place. This is why the change goes so much deeper than mood. When you shift who you're identified with inside, from the anxious narrator to the steady witness, your whole relationship to reality reorganizes. Setbacks stop feeling like confirmations of your worthlessness and start feeling like events that happen and pass. Criticism stops detonating and starts landing as information you can weigh. Fear still visits, but it no longer runs the meeting. You're the one running the meeting now. And a person running their own inner meeting makes radically different choices than one being run by a voice they never chose. There's a specific practice Jung would likely offer if he were speaking to you directly, and it's disarmingly simple to begin. Tonight, when the inner voice says its familiar thing, the critique, the prediction, the old verdict, don't argue and don't obey. Just notice it, and then respond to it as though it were a separate person in the room. Ask it something. What are you protecting me from? How long have you been saying this? Whose voice do you actually sound like? You don't have to reach dramatic answers. The mere act of addressing the voice instead of being it begins to change the structure of your inner world. Do that consistently, and over months something quietly extraordinary happens. The conversation inside you becomes one you're actually participating in, rather than one you're merely subjected to. And a person who participates in their own inner conversation is, in the most literal sense Jung could mean it, writing their own life instead of reading someone else's script off a page they never agreed to. The reason this changes your reality isn't mystical, but it borders on it in effect. Your inner voice is the lens through which every experience gets interpreted before you ever consciously touch it. A rejection filtered through "I'm unworthy" becomes proof of a life sentence. The same rejection filtered through a voice that says, "That didn't work and I'm still here," becomes a Tuesday. Same event, two entirely different realities, determined entirely by the sentence that met it on the way in. You cannot always change the events. You have far more power than you think over the voice that greets them. If you've been feeling the weight of a narrator you never consciously hired, one that's been quietly deciding what you deserve and what you'll dare, the True Self-Discovery Guide was built for precisely this crossing. Those 24 exercises walk you through Jung's method of turning toward the inner voices, naming them, and slowly relocating your identity to that steadier center underneath. It's a way to start participating in the conversation instead of being narrated by it. You'll find it linked right below. Jung wouldn't promise you that changing your inner voice makes life easy. He'd promise you something more valuable and more true. It makes life yours. The events won't all bend to your wishes. Pain will still find you. But the running commentary that decides what all of it means, that becomes something you have a hand in. And a person who has a hand in the meaning of their own experience is living in a fundamentally different reality than one who lets an inherited voice assign the meaning for them. So here's where this leaves you, standing at the edge of your own inner conversation. That voice is speaking right now, even as you take this in. Maybe it's already telling you this won't work for you, that you're too far gone, that other people can change but not you. Listen to it. Really listen. And then ask yourself the one question that begins everything. Is that voice describing reality, or is it a frightened visitor wearing the accent of someone from long ago, trying to keep you exactly where you've always been? The moment you can genuinely ask that question, you've already begun. Because you've stepped out of the voice and become the one listening to it. You've picked up the pen, and whatever it's been narrating up to now, the next line is finally yours to write. If you haven't yet, take a look at True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises drawn straight from Jung's work on the inner voice and the parts of us we've never learned to speak to. It's a way to keep going once the conversation opens, to turn toward what's been running in the background instead of letting it run you. The link is right below.